I just wanted to say that it's an honor to be here. Thank you all for coming to the last session at the end of a really good week. So this photo is of wild mustard greens, novels, and I wanted to include it just as an introduction to a really traditional, locally available food that mothers use. It's really prized by a lot of the families that I've worked with. This particular one called it carne verde, which means green meat, which is just kind of telling of how they replace meat with it at times. Okay, so just to give you an idea of where we're going, I'm going to start with a little bit of background about my project and the site I was working at, and then talk about how that relates to some larger issues going on in Ecuador today. And then I'll talk about what questions I was asking and how I went about trying to answer them. And then talk about how mothers use food to promote and maintain health in the home, and more generally, their healthcare practices. And at the end, I'll discuss some of the implications for policy and research. And along the way, I just wanted to keep in mind something that this, I think, photograph really represents. And that is that categorizations such as traditional and commercial or food and medicine really break down when we start to look at practices. Here, this mother has a variety of store-bought foods in processed and unprocessed forms, as well as fava beans that were grown by her family that she just finished roasting in a traditional clay pan. And if you can see along the top of the shelf there's a bunch of herbs that she collected in the wild highlands. And she'll use that to make a digestive tea for her 2-year-old daughter, even her 3-week-old infant. By looking at these juxtapositions between different categories of foods and medicines, we can see how in mothers' practices they really break down. And by looking at practices, I really hope to highlight differences as well as patterns among different families, tensions between the different categories, diversity, and change that's constantly happening. And I talk about actor network theory, which looks at actors as both human and non-human, and sees the embodiment of their relationship through practices.
I got you.
Okay, thank you. So this study is part of my thesis research, my master's thesis research, and it's part of a larger grant looking at agricultural production practices, water practices, and nutritional practices in 3 communities in the northern Ecuadorian Andes. And the goal is to find ways that people are succeeding with the resources that they currently have, things that are currently existing in the communities, and eventually try and spread those to other families. I was part of the nutrition project, and with my interest in medical anthropology and ethnobiology, I wanted to focus on food for health and food as medicine. And I eventually kind of shifted to look at healthcare in general because of that. So the study site, as you can see, is right along the Colombian border in the Ecuadorian Andes. And the primary way that people make livelihoods there is by growing potatoes and fava beans, as well as selling milk from dairy cows. Thank you. Now, the province where I'm working is called Carchi. Nationally, there's a few important issues in Ecuador that this research relates to. One is that nutritionally, children are still experiencing a lot of problems. So 25% of children in Ecuador under 5 are stunted from chronic malnutrition, undernutrition. As well as that, there's a growing obesity epidemic in Ecuador. So what is known as the nutrition transition and epidemiological transition are both well underway, causing a double burden of disease for Ecuador that the healthcare system and the national government really has to address. In Carchi, development has, since the 1970s, has taken a strong push towards modernization in the form of the introduction of chemical agriculture, mechanization, and market integration. And this has caused Carchi to have one of the highest rates of pesticide poisonings worldwide. In 2000, Ecuador adopted the US dollar, which was really beneficial for wealthy Ecuadorians, but for the rural poor, it's created a lot of hardships. in 2006, Rafael Correa was elected as president and continues to be president. In 2008, Ecuador adopted a new constitution, which many of you may have heard of. It's kind of famous for including the rights of nature. It's based on an idea called summa causa, which is in the indigenous language of Quechua. It means the good life, or buen vivir in Spanish. It's a rights-based paradigm based on the ideals of interculturality and plurinationality, really including all the diversity that Ecuador has and trying to preserve that and promote it. Unfortunately, it's been really, really heavily criticized because the Correa government has promoted populism, but some people have called it a technocratic form of populism, which means that he's relying on experts to speak for people rather than people speaking for themselves. Now, in the healthcare system, this has meant that health is not considered a human right, and access has been expanded for a lot of people. A lot of people have access to free healthcare. But the question is, what kind of healthcare is it really including all these different voices of people and really seeing the needs from their perspective? So I'm going to look at that a little more. Thank you. So these are my three main research questions, and I'll just be focusing on the first two today. How do mothers maintain family health in the home? More specifically, how do mothers use food to maintain family health? And then more broadly, how do mothers navigate healthcare for their families? To try and answer these questions, I spent over 2 months in one village called Jesus del Montpellier in the province of Carchi. And my research is based primarily on participant observation. I spent from 3 days to over a week with 6 families, following the mother throughout the day, helping her daily tasks, interacting with the children. In addition to that, I conducted semi-structured interviews with all of those mothers and an additional 5 others to expand the sample a bit in the limited time that I had. And at the end of the interview, I conducted a free listing exercise. I focused on child illnesses and home remedies that the mothers had. All right. So, I'll get to my title now, Agüitas and Sopitas, which comes to play in how mothers use food for health. Agüitas means teas, and sopitas are soups. One theme that really came forth in mothers' practices and discourses around this is the idea of the past, antes, which they constructed as a really idealized past when everyone was healthier, the land was healthier, food was healthier. And there were 2 main reasons for this. One was that they saw that the diet was actually different. They used different foods, more traditional foods. And then also the food were produced without chemicals in this imagined epic, the time before chemicals. It wasn't really clear when exactly that came about. And this quote exemplifies that. I asked this mother, why are those foods healthier? And she said, porque es algo natural de la tierra que nace, which I translate as because it's something that grows straight from the earth, which points to their preference for the natural. It wasn't very clear exactly what natural was, but it included these ideas of more traditional foods, more locally produced foods, and foods produced without chemicals. And that idea came forth really clearly in postpartum care practices. So in Ecuador and a lot of areas in Latin America, mothers practice a 40-day rest period after giving birth. In other areas it's called a cuarentena, and here it's called la dieta. They're not allowed to work, cook, or anything at this time, and their mothers and husbands and mothers-in-law take care of them. The quintessential dish that you can see here during that time is chicken soup, which a lot of us know is a food for when we're sick. And here there's 2 caveats to the chicken soup. One is that the chicken has to be homegrown, or bruna, and the other is that it has to be male and not female, because female chickens will raise their body temperature too much. As well as foods like chicken soup that are used to strengthen a mother after birth, they use a lot of foods to enhance breast milk production, such as coladas, which in a lot of other areas of Latin America they use horchatas, as well as juices like this passion fruit juice, and a lot of different teas, medicinal teas. Another area where food for health comes to play is stomach health. So mothers see stomach health along the spectrum. There's a stomach that doesn't hurt at all, it's starting to hurt, it's starting to get a little bit of diarrhea, and then it turns into a full-blown diarrhea infection. And that's important to notice because it shows how health is a practice. Mothers can intervene at any point along that spectrum and try and push it in the direction of health, right? One of the most common ways that they did this was by giving the guava juice, which they see as constipating or drying, so to give the child diarrhea helps to balance the digestive system. They also give a lot of teas during that time, which I'll talk about. Okay. So beyond food, mother's home health care practices include a much wider pharmacopoeia of different herbs and animal materials and continues to use food. On average, each mother listed 36.6 species of remedy in 48 different remedies. And in total, the 11 mothers listed 137 species in 260 distinct remedies. Here I define species not in terms of biological species, which may bother some of you, but rather distinct substances or materials that mothers are using in the way that they talk about them and use them. So for example, a chicken and an egg come from the same biological species, but because mothers are using them distinctly, I classify them as different home remedy species. And remedies I define as the use of a species to treat a distinct illness. So for example, chamomile is one biological species and home remedy species, but it's used in 13 different remedies, which was twice as many remedies as any other species that I found. It's used from rubbing on a pregnant woman's belly to making an infusion for an eye wash or a diaper rash, to just using the infusion to treat a stomach ache. Other remedies are, other species are used in different preparations for different things, but are prepared the same way. So for example, anise tea that's pictured here is always prepared as an infusion, but it's used to treat a few different illnesses, such as stomach aches, colds, and used for breast milk production. Now on the other end of the spectrum is something like sugarcane alcohol, trago, which is used by all mothers in exactly the same way. And in this case, it's to treat esophago, which is an illness, you could call it a fright illness. It's really common and it's similar to susto in other Latin American countries. Children get diarrhea, they cry, they can't sleep at night. And mothers oftentimes treat this regardless of other symptoms that the child has, just in case of espanto, they want to be able to treat that. They'll spray alcohol over the body, use tobacco and chili peppers to treat it, and they expressed a lot of self-efficacy, talking about the ease, simplicity, and convenience of treating it at home. Some mothers will take their children to outside indigenous folk healers if they feel their children are really vulnerable or they don't have a lot of confidence in their abilities to heal, but in general, mothers really talked about how easy it was. They'll also definitely go to the doctor really often. I don't want to try and characterize home health care practices as the only options that mothers have. They'll assess the severity and type of illness, and they've expressed that finding a doctor that they can trust was oftentimes really hard. So implementing doctors' information, though, when they do go to a doctor, is never clear-cut. And I want to highlight how practices embody the knowledge dynamics between local knowledge, traditional knowledge, and global science that doctors are imparting. Mothers are practicing a vast store of knowledge that is a hybrid between a lot of different systems of knowledge. And it's important to recognize that, especially in the context of Ecuador that's promoting summa causa, the good life, and citizen participation. So as development continues and maybe continues to be based on expert knowledge, local people are continuing to practice their practices and combine different strategies in different ways that work for them, so it's important to support them in that. Currently, the nonprofit that we're working with is implementing workshops in communities to facilitate people to be able to lead their own workshops based on nutrition, providing recipe books with recipes that the mothers wanted to share with their families. So that's what's going on now. say thank you for everyone who made this possible, and thank you all for coming.
We can keep moving, and I think that we'll probably have questions as.
I have a question. So I was wondering, did you find any distinction between, again, this idea of like medicinal foods for specific ailments versus kind of just foods that were in generally healthy for the kids?
Oh,
Did they distinguish between that? What types of foods were those?
Yeah, definitely. There were some foods that were just generally healthy, like novels. They saw like, oh, that's healthy. But then sometimes mothers would talk about specific things that are in them, like, oh, they have iron in them, or something like that, which kind of shows possibly where they're getting knowledge about them. And yeah, in addition to foods being used generally, there are other foods that are used for really specific purposes. And it blurs, you know, it's not a clear line at all. Yeah.
Yeah, so the area that you were working in, I don't know if you mentioned, if you did, I didn't catch it. Was it predominantly an indigenous culture or more westernized rural, or a mixture of both?
Yeah, they don't consider themselves indigenous at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what age those are mothers have?
The mothers were between 17 and 41 years of age.
And there's a difference of treatment depending upon the age, or you didn't find that?
I didn't find that particularly. I think it would be useful to include a larger sample to be able to really see how that plays out. But these were all mothers with children under the age of 5 to be able to see how they're caring for young children. So it really depended on their children's age a lot of the times and how they were using food.
And I think we had one more question, and then we'll. Was it third?
I was going to ask, I don't remember them now, but you had 3 specific research questions. And I was just curious if you, at the end of the research, if anything was particularly surprising that you had expected when you initially designed the study.
Yeah. I wasn't expecting to be thinking or finding a lot about espanto or other non-biomedically recognized illnesses, but those were really common. And it wasn't surprising necessarily, but unexpected. Another thing is that I found that because biomedical healthcare has been really available since the 1990s, families talk a lot about doctors' nutritional recommendations. So that's part of why I talk so much about how traditional practices and nutritional science or global science are also down.
Thanks, Michaela.